And since you are a war correspondent, I thought we would talk about war because it is what everything in the news today is war. I mean, especially the ones in Ukraine and Gaza and the Ukraine war. We haven't talked about it in a while, but it's big in the news this week because the Republicans want to link more aid to Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine has become a defining test of American foreign policy, forcing the U.S. to confront a difficult question. How long should it continue backing Ukraine in a fight that has stalled with no clear end in sight? While some argue that supporting Ukraine is essential to defending democracy and deterring future aggression, others worry that pouring billions into a prolonged conflict risks repeating the mistakes of past endless wars. On Real Time with Bill Maher, the debate over U.S. support for Ukraine exposed these deep divisions, with Jane Ferguson and John Avlon making the case for continued aid as a necessary check on Russian expansionism, while Maher raised concerns about the financial burden and strategic viability of an unwinnable war. At stake is not just the fate of Ukraine, but the credibility of Western alliances, the future of global security, and America's ability to balance interventionism with domestic priorities. Will history remember this as a necessary stand against tyranny, or another costly miscalculation in the name of global leadership?
And since you are a war correspondent, I thought we would talk about war because it is what everything in the news today is war. I mean, especially the ones in Ukraine and Gaza and the Ukraine war. We haven't talked about it in a while, but it's big in the news this week because the Republicans want to link more aid to Ukraine to Biden doing something about the border, which would not be a bad idea in itself. I don't know why they have to be linked, but just to give you some stats, okay, they've spent 111 billion so far on this war. They want 61 billion more. I think some of that is for Israel as well. Problem is, it's a stalemate. After 2 years, they say the front line has moved less than 500 square miles of territory have changed hands. 150,000 Russian dead, 70,000 Ukrainian dead. We're still having fights over territory and armies in both here and Gaza. So I know the people, I've always tried to be good for the people of Ukraine and back them, and I think it's the right thing, but I also heard a lot, you were in Afghanistan, right? I remember Iraq, in both wars, we can still win this thing. But we couldn't in either one. What's your assessment on whether we can still win this one?
From Bill Maher's perspective, the argument for continued U.S. support for Ukraine, while noble in principle, demands a hard-nosed reality check. He has long been skeptical of America's tendency to engage in foreign conflicts without clear exit strategies, and Ukraine appears to be another example of an open-ended military commitment with no defined victory conditions. While he likely understands the geopolitical stakes, Putin's aggression, the importance of NATO deterrence, and the broader Western-led world order, Maher's primary concern remains one of pragmatism. At what cost? And for how long? Maher has questioned whether this war, much like past U.S. military interventions, has turned into a bottomless pit of spending with no tangible results. He isn't necessarily advocating for isolationism, but is pointing out an uncomfortable reality. After 2 years, over $100 billion in U.S. aid, and massive casualties on both sides, the battlefield has barely shifted. If this is supposed to be a war that weakens Putin and secures Ukraine's sovereignty, then why, despite all the resources poured into it, does it remain a bloody stalemate? His skepticism also extends to the political realities at home. The American public has finite patience for prolonged conflicts, especially when economic struggles, border security, and domestic instability are front and center in voters' minds. Maher likely sees the growing frustration among Americans who question why billions can be allocated to a foreign war, while issues like infrastructure, crime, and healthcare remain underfunded. He also recognizes that Republican opposition to further Ukraine aid, tied to unrelated domestic policies like border security, reflects a broader shift in priorities among voters who are growing weary of perpetual war spending. It's about the law of diminishing returns. If the U.S. keeps pouring money and weapons into Ukraine, but continues to see little strategic progress, then at what point does the investment stop making sense? While Ferguson and other foreign policy experts insist that supporting Ukraine is essential to preventing greater conflicts, Maher likely sees the risk of America entrenching itself in yet another war without a clear path to victory. And that's a history lesson he refuses to ignore.
I think it's dangerous to compare the war in Ukraine with the post 9/11 counterterrorism wars, where America was really sort of fighting shadows. They were chasing terrorists around the world. This is not a Ukrainian fight. This is not sending money just so Ukraine can fight its own war. This is a war against Vladimir Putin and his expansionism into Europe, essentially. I mean, this is a war for global world order. The geopolitical, geostrategic importance of this war is vastly bigger than any of the wars post 9/11, which were overreaches of American foreign policy.
But how long do we just stay in this stalemate? I mean, they thought it was going to be World War III, and it's really World War I.
The reason to fund Ukraine is because we learned the lessons of history, which is that you cannot reward aggression. And it's far cheaper to fund Ukraine now than to let Ukraine fall and then have the front move.
The growing Republican opposition to Ukraine aid is more than just political maneuvering. It represents a dangerous shift in America's global leadership and commitment to democratic values. While they acknowledge that political negotiations are part of Washington's reality, they see the attempt to tie Ukraine funding to border security as short-sighted and reckless, undermining a crucial international alliance for the sake of domestic point scoring. For Avlon, a centrist with a strong belief in bipartisan governance, the Republican demand to link Ukraine aid to border security is an example of dysfunctional short-term thinking. He likely sees this as a ploy that ignores the bigger picture, that stopping Russian aggression is about more than just Ukraine. It's about maintaining a rules-based international order. He would argue that America's credibility as a defender of democracy is at risk if it starts treating foreign aid like a political football. The inability to pass straightforward military assistance for Ukraine without political horse trading sends a dangerous signal to both allies and adversaries that U.S. support is conditional on the whims of domestic politics rather than strategic necessity. Ferguson, as a war correspondent, brings a humanitarian and security-driven perspective to the debate. She understands firsthand the real-world consequences of delayed aid: more destruction, more deaths, and a greater chance of Ukraine losing ground to Russian forces. She likely sees Ukraine's survival as an existential fight, not just for its own sovereignty, but for the broader European security order. To her, reducing military aid to a bargaining chip in a domestic policy fight disrespects the sacrifices Ukrainians are making daily on the battlefield. Ferguson's argument against appeasement is rooted in historical precedent. She would likely point to the failure to stop Hitler early in World War II as a cautionary tale of what happens when aggression goes unchecked. If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, she argues, what stops him from pushing further into Moldova or even testing NATO's resolve in the Baltic states? The cost of stopping him now through financial and military aid is far less than the potential cost of a full-scale war in Europe involving U.S. troops. Avlon would likely agree, framing it in terms of America's long-term security interests. He would argue that the lessons of history are clear. When the U.S. fails to deter aggression, the consequences are far worse down the road. He would push back against isolationist sentiments by pointing out that weakness invites conflict, and that allowing Putin to dictate the outcome in Ukraine would set a precedent for other authoritarian regimes, including China with Taiwan. From Avlon and Ferguson's perspective, this is not just about funding another war. It's about defending a democratic ally, maintaining global stability, and preventing future, costlier conflicts. They view the Republican push to tie Ukraine aid to domestic border policies as a reckless distraction that could have disastrous global consequences. For them, the stakes are clear. America must stand firm, act decisively, and ensure that Ukraine gets the resources it needs before the cost of inaction becomes far greater than the cost of action. What do you think? Should the U.S. continue supporting Ukraine at all costs, or is it time to reconsider our approach? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for tuning in and being part of this important discussion. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep bringing insightful conversations straight to you. See you in the next one. 那是谁的？Lips.